I don't think we need to give much context here. The question that we are trying to answer on this panel really is, how do we keep the downward trend of gun violence going year over year, right? How do we sustain what we have managed to succeed at over the last few years? So I'm going to start with Helen. I think it's on. So I want to start with you with a bit of a reality check. So we're celebrating, as we should, a huge reduction in gun violence. But 200 Philadelphians are going to have lost their lives this year to gun violence, and another nearly 700 have been shot and survived. So, and many people in the city are still reeling from all the death and the pain of the last several years. So, given that, how should we be thinking about this year and the reduction in violence?
All right, I'm going to try not to be a downer right away, so we'll ease into that. I think we should be celebrating this moment as much as you can celebrate the fact that the numbers are down, but there are still many people who have lost their lives, survivors who have been left, paralyzed, otherwise wounded, families left with humongous gaps in their lives. So there's reason to be hopeful, and I don't want to sort of be the person to be like, right away saying, but here I am. What has happened over the last year is something that we should make note of, that we should study, that we should try to replicate. And I think that this is why I was invited, because I'm the donor. But we have no hope of replicating that if we don't do some really basic things. And it's something that I've been pushing for in my own column since 2017 at least. And there has to be a full accounting of not just the money that we're spending on programs, but where the money's going, how well the programs are doing. And I want to very quickly say it's not because we want to end programs, but we want to sort of find the areas where we can sort of help programs do better. And maybe expand, maybe pivot to another neighborhood or another focus. And that's something that's been lacking for, like I said, since 2017. I remember writing the first column in 2017 when former Mayor Jim Kenney formed the first, I think, Office of Gun Violence Prevention, if I'm remembering this correctly. And the focus, I was told as I sat there with the guy that was in charge, he promised me, because I'd been screaming about this, like we're throwing money out the window with no real sort of idea of what the money's going towards, what impact it's having. And he sat there straight-faced and told me in 2017, Helen, we're gonna do it. We're gonna have a full and continuous accounting. And it is 2025. I've just left the Inquirer, and that has not yet happened in total. And so until we have that, we can continue to have these conversations, and we should. We can be very positive about the sort of steps that we've taken, but we won't really know sort of how to sustain it. So there you go.
So Patrick, I'm gonna shift gears a little bit. So your book came out in 2018, right? And looked at another time period of historic drops in violent crime across the country. So beyond the lives saved, what are some of the consequences of a steady drop in gun violence?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So I wrote a book that I started writing in 2014, which was one of the safest years in the history of the country. And the book was really about the consequences of the crime drop, the drop that started in the early 1990s and kind of reached a low point in 2014. And by the way, we're probably reaching a lower point this year. I mean, the pure fact that we're living in one of the safest years in the history of the country, maybe the safest year in the history of the country, is the context for this entire discussion. So what I found is that when violence falls, first off, there was a kind of suspicion that I heard a lot that when violence drops, it just happens in the touristy areas. I was living in New York at the time. This is just Midtown. This is just Greenwich Village. These are the places. The rest of the city, the outer boroughs, they didn't experience the crime drop. Things are still bad. The opposite is true. In every city where we were able to get data at the neighborhood level, really granular data on where violence was changing, we found that the greatest declines were experienced in the most disadvantaged communities, had the most impact on the most disadvantaged segments of the community. So that means that the decline in violence was, without a doubt, the most important public health advancement for Black men in several decades. It led to improvements in learning. It led to enormous reductions in racial gaps in academic achievement. It had long-standing impacts on upward mobility. So if you're living in a community where violence falls, your chances of rising up in the income distribution rise substantially. And all of those benefits are experienced most sharply by the most disadvantaged segments of the population. And so the drop in violence is an enormous benefit for reducing inequality. And alternatively, when violence rises, the most disadvantaged communities and the most disadvantaged segments of the population are hit the hardest. Okay, so this is I study urban inequality. I got into violence because I started to see it purely from the data as the fundamental challenge facing American cities. And when you think about the benefits of crime reduction, it is one of the most effective ways to reduce inequality.
Really interesting. So, Craig, you worked in the White House Office of Violence Prevention under President Biden, right, which launched in 2023, and you guys were around, I think you said 444 days or something like that. So not a huge amount of time, especially for a government agency, but you still saw some success, right? And so what was the key there, and how does that apply to local jurisdictions like a city of Philadelphia?
So, nice. In the early 90s, we saw the steepest decline in homicides in American history, 9%. Okay? This year, we're trending towards an 18% reduction. In the previous 2 years before that, 31%. So unless something crazy happens this winter, we will have cut this crisis in half in 3 short years. In half. There's no other health crisis we've been able to see that level of reduction in such a short amount of time than we are seeing with gun violence right now. And that's in every major city in the country. In fact, cities with over 1 million residents are trending ahead of other towns and cities. And so when we glaze, and not to pick on you, but when we glaze over our progress and our success, we are doing ourselves a disservice. We have saved thousands of lives, helped millions of families avoid tragedy. And as someone who's been shot before and nearly killed, I know what it means to not go through that. And so we have to be loud that not only are we fixing a problem, we have the solutions to reduce violence in our country. We've already figured it out. We already have the playbook. And it's very simple. We invest in community and violence prevention efforts, and we move accountability upstream. We pour into violence prevention, victim services, things that build community. Because again, our young folks are scared because they don't have that sense of community. They're scared of their neighbor, their friend, their cousin, their classmate, their basketball coach, their basketball teammate, their opponent, their rival, the person across the street. So we invest in programs to help build community by first working with those who are most at risk, and then building out from there to address the root causes. But that's a very easy step. And during the Biden-Harris administration, we invested $42 billion into violence prevention efforts, primarily focused on community-based violence prevention efforts. First with the Affordable Care Act, not Affordable Care Act, the American Rescue Plan for COVID relief, but then with the first law passed in 30 years, the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act. And that's nothing to laugh at, that we passed a law, we invested $42 billion, and now we're seeing the results. The other side of the coin is that we developed accountability measures that really focused upstream. We bulked up and built out the ATF, apprehended over 700 gun traffickers. One trafficker had trafficked 100,000 guns when we caught him, right? This was not a federal crime before 2022. We made it a crime, and we got the bad guys, the real bad guys, the ones that are profiting and pouring guns into the hands of our fearful and scared youth in our communities. And on top of that, we cracked down on the gun industry, the actual manufacturers that are literally sitting on yachts, making billions off of the blood of our children. And guess what? Those crackdowns on those guns get into the hands of those most at risk, is where we start to see a huge change. And that's the difference between a crime approach and a public health approach. You invest in people, you get to the source, just like we did with opioids, right? As opposed to cracking down on just individuals who have access to what's harmful. And so we did that. And in those short 446 days, we fully implemented that law. We moved forward 54 executive actions. And Democrat or Republican, the 10 years previous, we only had 2 executive actions on gun violence. We moved forward 54 on top of ensuring those billions of dollars are out the door. Now, a lot of that progress is under siege right now. But I think the biggest mistake that our opposition made was giving us a chance to prove what works. And now we have 3 years to show that this is how you do it. All y'all Eagles fans, y'all figured out how to win the damn Super Bowl. I'm sure you didn't change your playbook completely, right? And so with gun violence prevention, it's the same thing. We know what works. We have to invest and build on it and think about different ways to keep that momentum going.
Yeah, interesting. And actually, you talked about guns, which is a good segue. So, Adam, I'm interested in the. So, gun violence has gone down significantly in the last 3 years, but there hasn't really been a significant reduction in guns. I mean, there has been some. Obviously, there's been work done to stop trafficking. The state of Pennsylvania has not passed any major gun laws. So that might make people think that gun control and other gun laws don't really matter in the end, because actually gun violence has gone down without reducing the number of guns. So is that a fair assessment?
I mean, I think people can think that for sure. And I think what we have learned over the last few years, I mean, in the last 5 years or so, we have for the first time ever really given violence prevention and violence intervention programs the chance to succeed, right? We've invested, we've advanced the field, and it has done remarkable work. I think the question we're gonna have to ask ourselves is how low can it go? What is the lower limit of violence that we will experience as a city, as a state, if we don't deal with the trafficking issues, if we don't deal with the massive number of guns? There are more guns in this country than there are people. In the first 3 years of the pandemic, when violence was soaring, there were enough guns transferred and sold in Pennsylvania to give 1 to half of all Pennsylvanians. I mean, that's a astounding statistic, right? And so at the end of the day, where do we go from there? And I think that it's a both-and approach. We have to continue this infrastructure and investment that Greg and Patrick and Helen are talking about, that, and we've heard about throughout today, that has helped people de-escalate situations when the gun's present, right? When that gun is present in a moment of anger, when the gun is present in a moment of conflict or of fear, we're gonna see violence and we're gonna see death. I think it is probably naive and impossible at the end of the day to solve all anger in our society. There is a piece of this that is, I think, just fundamentally human. I have bad days, I get angry, we all get angry. We have experiences of depression and sadness. We heard from the Lieutenant Governor about firearm suicide. And the gun's presence in those moments is really a problem. So the key piece here is to say both and, right? How do we continue this infrastructure that we've been building? How do we continue to invest in it? And how do we build solutions that don't target the individuals who are committing the violence, but I think Greg's exactly right, goes after the pushers, the industry itself. Here in Pennsylvania, just 1% of gun dealers are responsible for half of all crime guns. So this isn't about going after every gun store. This isn't about going after every single dealer, whether you're a firearm owner or not. This is saying there's a small handful of bad actors who are preying on our communities and are preying on individuals and are preying on that fear that we heard the youth talk about that's real when you live in a city like Philadelphia, and preying on it to make money off the blood of children and saying, look, behave better and follow our laws to go after it. And if you're not, like in any other industry, whether you're a restaurant or anything else, we're gonna shut you down. And if you are stopping trafficking, if you are following our background check laws, you can still sell some guns. I think if we do that, what we will see is firearm ownership probably decrease some and probably not change some, but we will see the trafficking stop that fuels a lot of this violence.
And I want to add one quick thing. For folks who don't believe that gun laws matter or work, just look at the South, right? There's a reason why southern states are trending so far behind on the crisis of gun violence. It's not because they like to hunt and all of that. I've been to Maine. People hunt all the time in Maine, right? It's not about the culture. It's about the actual policies. And we're seeing mayors that are doing a great job, even in South Birmingham, Memphis, but they don't have the infrastructure. They can't create their own laws. Many of these cities in Tennessee, there's no minimum age to even own a firearm. So how do you even operate around preventing violence when young children can go to any situation with a firearm legally? And so I just want to reinforce that if we really are worried or doubt the efficacy of gun laws, just compare Louisiana to New Jersey, or compare Texas to California, and you'll quickly see the numbers are very different because of the laws, even if they have similar levels of investment.
Yeah, interesting. So, Helen, I want to touch on something that Greg kind of called me out for a little bit, which is, we do have to
Calling
celebrate.
me out, actually.
Oh, I'm sorry, I was
Yeah,
calling you out.
yeah, yeah.
Okay, well, I'm going to go back to you.
Oh,
I
everybody
heard
out.
you.
You
So-
next, Adam.
I
The
know.
perce-
I know.
The perception piece of it, I think, is interesting, right? So, the young people here talked about the fear that still exists. We talked to the gun violence numbers are significantly down. It is significantly safer. I mean, you're saying that this might be the safest year in American history, or whatever, recent American history. But people don't necessarily feel that, and so why is that, I guess, and then also what do we need to do so that people see that and feel it and live it?
I mean, I think somebody may have mentioned it, but despite the numbers being down, the fact of the matter is that the shootings and the gun violence is affecting a lot of the same neighborhoods. That their reality has not changed, right? I've covered gun violence for years, my whole journalistic career, before I came to Philadelphia. And the mother, the father, the sister, the brother, the community that's grieving, the young people or the people who've been lost to gun violence don't care about the numbers. The numbers don't mean anything to them when they're living through this grief. What they're living through is someone that they loved is lost. And again, I'm not glazing over. I think was that the term? The low numbers. I'm not saying we shouldn't celebrate it and note it, but what we should remember is that for communities that are still dealing with this day in and day out, these numbers don't mean anything. These numbers have not changed their reality. These moms that I talk to day in and day out are still are still dealing with the loss of their children, the loss of whole generations that they saw grow up. And while they're hopeful, I'm going to tell you something, you're not going to find anybody more hopeful than people who have lost and who are on the streets and just fighting this good fight because they've been drawn into it, because they've lost someone, because they have no choice but to be hopeful and optimistic and think, you know what? These guys that are coming in telling me that the numbers are great and that these programs are working, they must know what they're talking about. And I'm there going, I'm not saying they don't know what they're talking about. I'm saying, show us the data. Let's make sure that we can sustain this. That's what I'm saying. And that there are programs that we have studied, that they've done accounting and that we know work mostly to a great extent. But there are a large number of programs that we're just not sure. We think they work. We hope they work. It looks like they work. And all I'm saying, as someone who's covered this and who's talking to mothers and fathers and families and communities that are just under siege still, even while we're like, hey, we're doing great. All I'm saying is just like, let's make this sustainable. Let's really prove that all of these programs work. And if they don't work, let's make them better so that it affects everyone in every neighborhood. That's all.
Can I jump in on this?
We're going to have a cage fight later.
Let's do it. Let's do it.
Yeah.
I live in a neighborhood that is impacted by this every day. When I was in the White House, I live on Congress Heights, 3136 Stanton Place. My house was shot up 16 times. And the next day I had to go into work, right? So I want to be very clear. I am not out of touch with what's happening in our communities. It's not their community. This is my community. This is my neighborhood. These are my neighbors, my friends. But what I will tell you is the reason people don't feel more safe is because we have been so shy about talking about what's working. And as opposed to getting out front and being bold that, hey, the reason you haven't heard gunshots every other Saturday is because we're doing work that's working. If we aren't telling that story boldly and loudly as politicians, as journalists, as activists, as experts, as academics, then why would people feel better about it?
in
You know, and
Philadelphia-
we have reduced violence by 48%. I don't know what other proof we need. I don't think we need more studies on how well this works. I think we need more resources to scale and grow what works, especially in a time where we have an administration in the White House that's scapegoating undocumented immigrants, that's blowing up boats in Venezuela, in a time where we are seeing historic reductions and saying those are the bad guys. We have the solutions. We know what works. It's working. And we have to tell those stories or our communities will never feel safer. The gun industry is literally marketing fear. They're marketing fear. And we're still sitting back and saying, well, maybe this, maybe that. And I'm not picking on you. I mean, it's a very common kind of sentiment. But we have got to combat this real marketing of fear with hope, with progress, with life, with joy, with community. But most importantly, recognizing that we should celebrate every life saved, every single day.
Yeah, I mean, I don't agree. I don't disagree that we've been. Well, I guess I do disagree that because I've told these stories my whole career, so I have not been shy to both celebrate and criticize or be critical. But in Philadelphia, I can tell you that we've also been really shy to actually have a full accounting of all the programs and to make sure they're working as well as they should be, and to make sure that the city and federal funds that are shrinking, as you know, nobody here knows that more than you, are being spent or being put in the right places. And that's what I think that's a shyness that I'm just like, let's do something about that. So.
Can I just add one other piece, maybe take a slightly different. I mean, I think there's an interesting dichotomy going on in how we tell the stories. Right? When we talk about the reductions in violence, we talk about numbers. And when we talk about violence, we talk about stories, right? Where did the shooting happen that Brett was telling us about, right? Robert Clemente Park, right? And what that experience was, and then we hear about it. And I think one of the things we have to get away from when we're telling a little bit of the story around the violence reduction, or the way we need to change the way we tell those stories, is actually to make it really real for people. When I go, and I'm going to talk about a little bit of the politics for a second. So I spent a lot of time in the Philadelphia suburbs, actually, right, which is not what we're talking about here. But from a lens of trying to get more funding that the lieutenant governor talked about, those are, frankly, the political folks I need to back funding for these kind of programs to advance all the initiatives we're talking about. And what I hear from both legislators and constituents is they don't understand how these programs work. And what we know is that humans are stories, right? You tell stories. I mean, amazing stories. You are a storyteller. Excellent. And what we need to do is change how I think we tell the violence intervention story. Not just about the numbers, but the example that Dion gave earlier that makes it something that sticks in your brain, and then also do the accounting. And so I just wanted to kind of pull out of this a little bit and think about the numbers will not be enough. They'll never be enough because they are always someone else's child, and one is too many, right? And we've said that again and again. But the narratives of how we saved a life, I think, can connect with people and make the programs more concrete in a way that will help us both hold people accountable and get more resources to these programs.
So actually, Patrick, one of the things that your research has shown, right, is that money going into these neighborhoods, into nonprofits in the neighborhoods, into filling storefronts, even if they are not specifically gun violence intervention, gun violence prevention organizations, actually has an impact. Can you tell us about that a little bit?
Sure, yeah. And I want to be careful because like most of the organizations represented in this room are doing the most direct work to prevent violence. And that means in doing the work in the places where violence is concentrated and engaging young people who are at the absolute highest risk of violence. Just the distribution of people who actually shoot a gun has a very long tail. That means it's a small number of people who are engaged in a substantial amount of violence. And so there is a hugely important role for those groups that are directly engaging that segment of the population in the most disadvantaged communities where violence is most common. That said, the work that I did, and this was work looking at the drop in violence in the 90s again, looked at any organizations that were reaching out, that were looking out in the community, providing services for housing, for addiction, for mental illness, the types of organizations that were just mentioned in the last panel, Boys and Girls Clubs, community health centers. And what I found is that as these kinds of organizations grow and proliferate, and there was a huge mobilization that took place in the 1990s. This was a big part of the story about why violence fell in the 1990s. These kinds of organizations, community organizations that are focused on preventing violence, but that are also focused on building stronger communities, played a central role in contributing to the crime drop. And we quantified that and put it through the ringer to determine whether it was actually a causal impact or not. And I became extremely convinced from that work that, first off, we have institutions other than the police and the prison system that should be central institutions in the effort to reduce violence. Secondly, when these organizations emerge, when community residents mobilize, come together to deal with the problems in their own communities, and when they're given the resources to do that in a sustained way, they can be remarkably effective. This finding is bolstered by lots of randomized controlled trials that have led to the same conclusion. And to your point, Ellen, like, we don't want to romanticize these organizations. There are lots of nonprofits that do terrible work, let's be honest. There are lots of organizations that are ineffective. There's lots of corruption in the nonprofit sector. That said, if we held this nonprofit sector, if we held like the police department to the same standards as the nonprofit sector, we'd be telling a very different story. What's the budget? Does anyone know the Philadelphia police budget, roughly?
I think it's $1 billion.
Almost $1 billion, $800 million, something like that. The investments that were made in the Biden administration were absolutely historic. Absolutely historic. This is the first time in decades that a presidential administration recognized community violence intervention as a core part of the effort to reduce violence. The investments that came through the American Rescue Plan, the Bipartisan Safer Communities program, were, I think, one of the most important symbolic statements. And the actual resources that proliferated out into American cities are a core reason why violence has fallen the past few years. I'm convinced of that. When you look at the actual scale of funding, this was a couple $100 million dispersed across the entire country for a couple of years. That is now drying up. Hundreds of millions of dollars were just frozen a couple of months ago by the new administration. The scale of resources going to community violence intervention is just, it's not even comparable to the scale of resources that go to law enforcement. So, what I would say is we have excellent evidence, extremely strong evidence, that community organizations can play a central role in responding to violence, that they can do so while also building stronger communities, and we've just never thought of these organizations as central in the effort to confront violence. They've never been given the resources to do their work in a sustainable way.
Can I just say something, add something to your great points about community organizations? I've covered many community organizations in Philadelphia, a lot of the smaller ones, grassroots. And one of the many reasons I push so hard for a full accounting is because I've written about some of the smallest, most effective community organizations doing the work, the kind of work where I can see, because I've covered them for years, actually works. But they also are begging for money. Like they're begging for support that they can't get because the support's going to other places because of a million reasons. Because other organizations have been around longer. They have the infrastructure to apply for grants, where the smaller organizations have 2 people literally on the street every night by themselves. So they don't really have the time to go figure out how to even ask for a grant, let alone write one, right? So that's one of the many reasons that I do that. One of the stories that I wrote, a bazillion years ago, was a guy who's still doing a lot of the work. And because I'm aging as I sit here, I can't remember the name. I don't know what's happening. But I remember him having a hunger strike somewhere. I think it was on Broad Street for days. And I was really, you're supposed to be, I was a columnist, so I could sort of share my opinion. But I was legitimately worried, this man is going to drop dead. And he is fighting for really what amounted to crumbs, for doing the kind of work that mattered, because I saw it, because I was covering these neighborhoods, every day, And he could not get a grant. He could not get attention from the city. That has changed. But the man almost dropped dead in the middle of a major street in Philadelphia. That should not have to happen. And that's why I feel like if we have, an actual accounting, we could be like, you know what, this group is doing some tremendous work. They deserve our support. Maybe we pivot some money from the gigantic group with the 10 people sort of in executive positions that will go, I'm not naming, but like we should pivot some of that money to this group. And that's why I pushed so hard.
So, Greg, we talked a little bit about the fact that federal money is drying up or has dried up for a lot of these efforts. The state of Pennsylvania just passed a budget, finally, that gave $10 million additional money for gun violence prevention programs, which is not a ton of money. Are you seeing, do you see other states and cities kind of stepping up to do this?
Yeah. What's exciting is, and I think you spoke to it very well, is that the federal investment was really a drop in the bucket. Even though those billions sound huge, when you look at how that's spread across towns and cities across the country, it's not enough to scale and sustain most of these organizations. But it did create a starting line for cities and states to step in and lean in. And so since the Biden administration, we went from one statewide office of violence prevention to 17. We went from 24 city offices to now over 130. And I don't have a tally of all the investments, but what we're seeing is that investments are following the infrastructure. And it's really, really exciting to see everyone scale. And even in places like the South, we're seeing Memphis scale. We're seeing Baton Rouge scale. We're seeing New Orleans scale, places that are far removed from the Chicagos, the Phillies, the Pittsburgh, the New Yorks that have decades of experience in this space. And I think it's really exciting. We're also seeing more infrastructure being built nationwide to share the best practices, one of which is the Community Violence Intervention Leadership Academy. See one of our cohort graduates right here, Jamie. But where we're seeing folks who come together across the country that are learning, that are training, that are developing, and sharing those best practices, and also sharing expertise and training. We also are seeing the advocacy work grow and swell, and so big shout out to Adam, but there are Adams all over the country that are fighting for different policies, but also fighting for resources. And we're seeing some pretty historic progress there, especially in the Midwest. And so I'm really, really excited about the resources that are growing. There are some big blind spots, though. Like, again, the Southeast is still suffering a great deal. The Southwest is pretty far behind the rest of the country in a lot of this work. And I think the one that I'm most concerned about federally is really the dismantling and defunding of the ATF, because we are literally losing the infrastructure that can hold the industry accountable, that can cut down on trafficking, and can make sure guns don't pour into our neighborhoods. And so states and cities have to think about how they can build more infrastructure, or even start to think regionally, right? Like, how do we work together, Delaware, Pennsylvania, Virginia, North Carolina, to fight against these guns that are being trafficked from these states with really weak laws?
So, Adam, ceasefire does a lot of work, particularly around guns. But ceasefire, the name of ceasefire is to stop the shooting, right? So one of the questions I have, given Pennsylvania, given how difficult it is to really pass gun laws in Pennsylvania, where do you recommend people, our elected officials, spend their political capital? What should they be really focusing on in this moment to keep these numbers down?
Well, I think first is the funding. I mean, we still see really strong bipartisan support in Harrisburg for this investment in violence prevention. We had multiple Republican legislators send letters of support for $100 million in funding for violence prevention. Not quite what we got, but but really see that really strong support. And I think as we have those conversations, there's a place around this to talk about it in a different way. It doesn't sort of trigger this question of, are you taking my guns, right? And so I think the first piece is that. I think the second piece is, I just have to know, when we talk about gun safety laws and these common sense laws that we're talking about, it is only partisan in Harrisburg, right? And it is only an issue there. I go all over the state, from the most rural parts of the Poconos and like north central Pennsylvania to cities like Reading and York. And whether I'm talking to gun owners, hunters, conservatives, et cetera, on the whole, they all support secure storage. As an example, one of our board members has someone who's hunted for a long time on their land, and recently decided to broach a conversation that was uncomfortable with him about, his perceptions of firearm laws. And he supported extreme risk protection orders, and he supports secure storage laws. And this is a gun owner and someone who's definitely more conservative. And so having those conversations is a real opportunity. I think the last is this question of the industry itself. I think we're seeing a really intent focus, both legally and from policy on this. Montgomery County has to kind of come back to this, but recently started to inspect gun dealers. So, while ATF is getting dismantled and that is going to do significant harm, there's a lot of work the state police and local sheriffs can actually do to hold gun dealers accountable. The Neubauer Foundation has supported some of that work with us. And I think that is going to be really critical, because what we are again saying is that this is flowing the trafficking of firearms into our communities. And it's important to understand that for Philadelphia for a moment, right? I think most people don't know, we only have about 4 gun dealers left in the city of Philadelphia, depending on who you ask, 4, 5, 3, 6. Most guns that are used in violent crimes here in the city come in from the suburbs. District attorneys like Kevin Steele go after those traffickers. The new, in Bucks County, we have a new district attorney coming in, Joe Kahn. And so a lot of this is, how do we get the suburbs to stop flowing firearms into our communities? It takes 10 minutes to get to the, depending on where you're talking about, to the suburbs, maybe a little longer for certain parts of it. And, those guns come in and cause violence here. And I think those opportunity there is to say, this again isn't about you as an individual and your access to gun. It's about a corporation, financial self-interest for these major industries to cause harm in our communities. And that's not what you want, and that's not what I want. And I think that's a real opportunity to continue to raise up.
Okay, so first of all, I apologize, Joy. I was supposed to remind everybody to send questions to Slido, but hopefully you all did that. Okay, so I think we're ready for questions from the audience.
Okay. Let's start here. Jalil Meekins, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. As a survivor and father who lost my son, shouldn't every drop in violence give us hope? And shouldn't the community have transparent numbers?
I think we would say yes on
Yes.
this panel. Does anybody want to answer that further?
The one thing that I think is, when I think about like trends in violence, and particularly drops in violence, I think about it in 2 ways. And one is why is violence rising or falling in a particular place at a particular time? And most criminologists, most people studying the issue focus on that. The second piece of it, though, is why are communities consistently vulnerable to surges of violence? And so I think we have a dual challenge here. One is to celebrate every drop in violence and recognize these are lives saved. These are communities that don't have to deal with the horrific consequences and spillover effects of violence. But then secondly, we have to think about what makes communities vulnerable to the next shock that comes down the pike. Because there's going to be another shock that comes down the pike. And so, part of the challenge is thinking about, okay, how does concentrated disadvantage make communities persistently vulnerable to violence? How does the proliferation of guns make communities consistently vulnerable to violence? Even if they're going through a moment where violence is falling right now, we just have to keep that in our mind, how to take that next step to make communities less susceptible to the next shock that comes around.
Can I just add something about stuff to celebrate? Because one of the things that, regardless of numbers, accounting, whatever, that we should celebrate, that I celebrate, is sort of how these stories are being told and who's telling these stories increasingly. We have a ways to go still, but it's changed so much even in the time that I've been telling these stories. And it matters a lot. To the communities, but to the narratives that we tell ourselves nationally and locally. And that's something that we should celebrate. And it's also something that makes communities less vulnerable, when they have the power of having their voices heard, elevated, and when their voices lead to some change. And it's, again, we have a ways to go, but it has changed dramatically, even in the time that I've been writing these stories, because it wasn't that long ago where would walk into my newsroom, and be told by editors, are you writing about this again? Can you write about something else? Maybe go to the suburbs. Is there anything else you could write about besides gun violence? And that's hand to God that those words are told me. And I'm just like, and I would just continue to write these columns and these stories because they mattered. Because people's voices were being ignored, and it's changing. And now, one of my pet peeves, and I'm going to tell you that I'm falling on my sword, because coming up as a journalist, we were all told, like, we're getting into this to give voice to the voiceless. Frankly, that's bull, because these communities, all these people, everyone has a voice. But those of us in power with these platforms, we're just not listening to these voices. We're not elevating these voices. And now, again, even though we have a long way to go, it's dramatically better. And I think that in the end, that's going to make our communities, our cities, our nation less vulnerable and safer.
Yeah. I'll just add, I mean, we have to, I want to reinforce, we have to be bold about what's working and why, because our narrative is being taken before our eyes. We have an industry that's marketing that, hey, it's dangerous out here. You need to be armed. If you live in the suburbs, you got to be armed because they're coming from the inner streets. If you're in the inner streets, you must be armed because your neighbor's armed. We also have a president now that's reinforcing fear and fear-mongering and selling it to us and pointing fingers and calling neighborhoods slums, openly calling people thugs, calling reporters piggies today, right? But someone who does not care about how we feel and how we operate every day, but is very comfortable selling fear and hate. And so we have to really be bold about that messaging. We need mayors to be very loud. I'm a huge fan of Mayor Scott in Baltimore, someone who's been very bold about the work that's being done, the progress that's being done. But I think it's no mistake that more businesses are coming to Baltimore, that more folks are going outside and having a good time, that the home ownership numbers are going up, that the tax revenue is going up. Why? Because the narrative has shifted, and you have a mayor who's leading that charge and changing the tone. And I think if we continue, all of us, to be a part of changing that tone, not only will our neighborhoods be safer, we can start to combat that feeling of fear, right, that is holding so many of our folks hostage and, frankly, breaking down that sense of community we need to get back to a safe environment.
I think we have time for one more question.
Yes, real fast before I ask that. Somebody wrote in, Helen, to say the gentleman's name is Ryan Harris. He's the founder of As I Plant
He's
This.
a rock star,
There you
when
go.
I tell you. Like,
Okay.
I mean, not to force you to go look at my columns, but go find those columns, because what he did was amazing.
I thought it was
What he does
nice.
every day is amazing. So.
Someone filled in the blank, so there
I
we
did
go.
say I was
Ryan
getting
Harris.
old, and the names are just leaving my head.
But related to what you were saying, Greg, how did Baltimore cut violence in half without reducing the number of guns? Are politicians using, in quotes, guns as an excuse for not making effective strategies?
For Baltimore? Well, I think Philadelphia, you all are blessed with a very vibrant CVI and community ecosystem. I think in Baltimore, there's a very similar ecosystem, but you have a mayor who comes from a community that's impacted, that's a believer from day one, and is willing to be the front of that whole charge. He's also been very instrumental in pushing and pulling all government agencies to be a part of the solution by training every single employee on trauma-informed care and really setting a tone that this is not a law enforcement issue or just a community issue. This is all of us that has to come together and lean in on top of the investments, on top of the strategy, on top of the plan. And there's some experts here. I ain't gonna take all that thunder from Baltimore. Stan, raise your hand real quick. You. Yes, that's one of the number one experts who helped, was one of the architects of the plan, of strategy in Baltimore. But I think it makes a real difference when you invest, when you have strong laws, when you have an actual strategy, and most importantly, you have someone at the top of the chain that's willing to fight and push and really sometimes even drag the rest of government to be a part of it.
So I'm sorry, did you say that that Mayor Scott has every one of the city employees trained in trauma-informed care?
Yeah, I believe that was year one. Am I right?
Very interesting.
Yeah, year one.
I just want to add on the gun piece of this equation. I just have to come back. So Greg pointed out, like, the states that are the safest have the lowest rates of gun violence, right, have both of these things. They have really strong violence prevention intervention programs, and they have strong laws. So just let's take Massachusetts for 1 second. So before I came up here, in 2023, which was the first year everyone saw a big reduction, the gun homicide rate in Massachusetts was 5.6 per 100,000. The other way around, was 1.8. In Pennsylvania, it was 5.6. So even when you look at these states that have some really strong ecosystems, that have all these pieces, those gun laws can be really critical in driving gun homicide rates down significantly, a 75% more decrease. We would be looking at a sub 100 number here in Philadelphia, potentially, right? And so I think, again, we have to come back to, it's not a red herring. I think what we really need to hold on to is what the last, I'd say, 10 years have shown. And many people have been doing this work a lot longer and have known it for a lot longer. So we should really acknowledge that, especially here in Philadelphia, where a lot of it started years ago, is that if you do both, you can really start to get close to, I don't want to use the word completely eliminating, but creating this significant reduction where you are talking about a handful of homicides a year, potentially, not even the hundreds. And so I think that is the thing. How do we have that conversation around the funding and the violence intervention and the gun access question at the same time?
Great. Thank you all very much. And thank you to the person who was trying to broker the peace between these two, who asked the question about can't we have both? Because I believe we can have both. So thank you.
Thank you.